The White House right now is working overtime to downgrade expectations when it comes to this week's meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. And in doing so, they have now scaled back from it being peace talks and land swaps to this is just a listening exercise to see whether or not Putin actually wants peace. And this is something that is very weird, because we went from a full-on thing to now a listening exercise, which makes you go, wait a minute, what happened here? How did we get to this point? Because realistically speaking, and I'm not saying this to scare you guys, I'm being honest with you, Friday's meeting is scary between Trump and Putin, because it's going to decide whether or not Europe needs to prepare for war in the next few years, or whether or not Donald Trump will realize that Putin is just pure craziness, and the only real way to stop him is with secondary sanctions and tariffs and more weapons to Ukraine and more pressure onto Russia. And that, of course, has European leaders and Ukrainian officials all holding their breath to figure out what's going to happen, as though Trump is ignoring the coalition of the willing. But how did we get here? Why is this meeting even happening? And it's mostly because of miscommunication between Steve Witkoff, the now Russian envoy for peace negotiations, and his will to break U.S. protocol to have a Russian Kremlin-provided translator instead of a U.S. one, which has now created a miscommunication to world leaders. And I think that Trump got stuck in that. And even though we're at a point to where this meeting is happening, it's now a pointless meeting because of said inexperience. And so I just want to back up for a second here. Well, we go back months ago where the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, had said from the get-go, the only time Trump is ever going to meet with Putin is if there is a real chance of peace. Now, Donald Trump is going through this whole Nobel Peace Prize mindset where he wants to do everything possible to get that prize. And I don't think he really truly cares what happens to Ukraine as long as he stops it, because that would give him that prize. And in doing so, even though there's not been any indications that Russia really truly wants peace, Trump is moving forward with it. And that all stems because that said conversation with Steve Witkoff and Putin supposedly went well with land swaps, and he was told that information. But later on, in other conversations that Steve Witkoff had to have with world leaders, we're finding out that's not what was said. Now, Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, has gone to Russia multiple times, and every single time, nothing ever came of it. Actually, no, something did, which is Russia, they keep on presenting new opportunities to him in the United States to where, hey, when this war is over, you guys can do X, Y, and Z and make a lot of money. Steve Witkoff, being a billionaire, loves this. This is why they always talk him up, and that's why the economics minister is always there when Witkoff comes in. But Witkoff, being very inexperienced, doesn't understand that when you have these meetings, you need to have a trusted translator. Because if you have someone that they provide, they could give you the wrong information, which sways people in certain ways so that other things happen, versus someone who you vetted, who's gone through background checks, who would actually be working for the U.S. people to make sure the right information is getting out so that the right information is relayed. And so in this last conversation that he had, supposedly, it came back that Putin wants to do a land swap and then a ceasefire, or Ukraine would get Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Russia, they would get Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. After that was said, I guess Trump went, well, there's actually a chance for peace, and started getting the ball rolling on a peace negotiation or a sit-down with Putin. But as the days went on, Steve Witkoff had to clarify or re-clarify the conversation, because then it became the land swap would then be Sumy and parts of Kharkiv, which is comparing like little tiny blueberries to watermelons. They're completely different things. And then the story changed even then, which is that Ukraine just needs to remove themselves from those territories completely, and then we'll have a ceasefire. But by that point, Russia had already convinced the United States to get the ball moving on a major meeting between the world leaders. And Trump was not going to pull out of that because that makes him look really weak. In which that Steve Witkoff miscommunication now has put Donald Trump in a scenario in which he needs to meet with Putin no matter what. They chose Alaska. Today we found out it's Anchorage, Alaska, and what you are. If you are in Alaska, get your Ukrainian flags out and get out there. But now we get back to this press conference in which we see Tammy Bruce and we see Karoline Leavitt sit down and say that, and I want to quote some of these here, that both officials are clarifying the meeting is not a negotiation. They're not there to talk about a peace deal. Leavitt describes the bilateral meeting for Trump as a, quote, for Trump to get a more firm understanding of how we can hopefully bring this war to an end. Tammy Bruce then says that this meeting is a feel-out meeting where the U.S. president will see what Putin has in mind. This comes after those multiple meetings from Witkoff. This comes from multiple phone calls with Trump and Putin. If you don't know that by now, then I don't know what to tell you. Putin from day one has said he's not stopping. Witkoff should have given you the information, but miscommunication caused that not to happen to create this meeting that no one ever asked for and no one wants. Americans, we don't want a murderous dictator and war criminal in our country, which is why they picked Alaska, one of the furthest states out where we can't mass protest in hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple thousand. And keep in mind that this is the first time that Putin would actually see some kind of pushback because he only visits countries in which they love him. He's never seen the world stand up against him. And the one thing that people don't understand about this meeting is that, yes, it is a pointless meeting for us in Ukraine and Europe, but for Putin, this is everything. He's being put on the same level as the most important president in the world. And so he's going to use this PR campaign to the T, telling Russians, look, they're on our side. I'm smiling and shaking hands with this man. Look where we're at. And it comes at a place in which a lot of Russians, they still feel that Alaska is a Russian state, even though it's not. Russia sold it to the United States. This is going to be a PR disaster. And the worst part is, there's nothing we can do. And it comes at a point to where we have seen Trump in the past few days kind of blame Ukraine again for Russia's war. I mean, we saw Trump just yesterday say that he was frustrated with Zelensky because when it comes to land swap, he has to go back to his parliament to get approvals. But when it comes to war, he could just kill and kill, which makes no sense. Logic states that Ukraine was attacked and they had to defend themselves. You know what I mean? It's not a fact that Zelensky woke up and said, let's have a war with Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. If Ukraine didn't get into a military state overnight, they would have been fully conquered. Which, once again, leads us to where we're at right now, where Donald Trump is sitting down with Putin in a meeting that doesn't mean anything. But if he's going into this with a pro-Russian mindset, with fake information from Witkoff, with people whispering in his ear Russian propaganda like Tulsi Gabbard, then we have a problem in which if Trump agrees with Putin on things that don't make any sense and decides that he's not going to support Ukraine or allow weapons to Ukraine or stops putting pressure onto Putin, then European leaders are terrified because then you're rewarding Putin. And we go back in history. We can see, just even most recently in 2008, we already tried this whole, let's give them some land and we'll see what happens. We did that under Obama. We've tried Minsk I and Minsk II, and Russia violated everything so many times. And all Ukraine was asking for from the get-go was, I just want to have a ceasefire. Let's just have a ceasefire and let's talk. Let's see if peace can actually work. And even Zelensky, a couple months ago, said, look, I get that land's a thing and we might have to do something here and there. But if you provide us a path to NATO, if you give us, the weapons we need, the security guarantees, the EU, or at this point now, it's Coalition of the Willing Troops inside of Ukraine. And if we can guarantee that Russia will never do this again to Ukraine or any other country, then we could talk about giving up land. But Russia doesn't see that. And as Zelensky said in his latest speech tonight, there is absolutely no signs on the battlefields or even in the Russian borders that they plan on stopping their war, because the Russian economy is a war economy at this very moment, where interest rates are 21%, you're now looking at, I think last time I checked the numbers, it may be at 11% inflation inside of Russia, which means that people are not buying cars or houses or starting new businesses. They can barely afford the food on their table. This is really, truly the first signs that pressure on Russia, sanctions and tariffs do work. Heck, today we're seeing that Russia announced they're going to have an emergency meeting with oil companies inside of Russia to try to lower the price of gas. Since the beginning of the year, Russian gas has exploded to be over 50% of the cost. Since the beginning of summer, it's 23%. And since the beginning of August, it's 7%. It went up 7% in 12 days. And that's a mix of many different things. From Ukrainians targeting oil refineries, in which actually, as I'm recording this video at 5 p.m. Eastern time, Ukrainians have sent hundreds of drones, or at least 150 odd drones, into Russia to target said oil refineries. Between oil refineries being hit, the demand not being there, and the fact that Russia has now added in a complete ban of selling Russian gasoline out of the country, those prices aren't coming down because people can't afford to travel unless you're ultra wealthy, in which pretty soon they're going to be hit, as Russia is going after the richest with all of these new taxes. But if you look at all these things, you say to yourself, oh, pressure works. Adding tariffs work. And the threat of secondary sanctions will hurt Russia. You look to see what's happening in India, in which now there is a 50%, which is starting, I believe, in the next at the 27th of August. We already see some, not all, but some oil facilities inside of India decide that they're not going to buy. And that is now the beginning of things, because it doesn't look like Trump will be letting up. And as we've discussed many of times, if you go after the people buying said Russian oil, then Russia won't be able to make as much money, which means they're unable to afford their war, in which then they'll start squeezing their people. And after a while, the people are going to get angry and eventually, hopefully, start rebelling against their own country and their own president, in which we already see some Russian oligarchs being very angry with Putin, since they didn't expect for this thing to last 3 years. So add in Ukrainians going after oil and secondary sanctions and tariffs, we could see Russia get into a depression on its own. And if we can make Russia spend so much money to go bankrupt, you're saying, wait, this is history. This is repeating history, right? That's what we did with the Soviet Union, yes. The difference being is that at that point, we were outspending them on military gear, and now we'd be suffocating them by shutting down all of the areas in which they're making money. This, my friends, once again, is a scary time. Because if we don't set an example, if we don't punish Putin or Russia or any other oligarch out there, they're going to be saying to themselves, you know what, we fought for 3 years, but eventually the world gave up. Now, could we do that to the rest of Ukraine? Could we do that to Baltic states? We saw, recently in Lithuania, Belarus throw that drone right in the middle with really, actually, and I hate to say this about Lithuania, there was nothing stopping it. It went right through, which was a test to see how they would react. We could be looking at the beginning of history. This meeting could be the beginning of some of the, I would say, paragraphs or chapters inside of history books for the future. And the scary part is that at least at this moment, being August 12th, we don't know what's happening. I could tell you that tomorrow there's going to be a meeting, a Zoom meeting per se, between European world leaders, Zelensky, and Donald Trump, to hopefully put him in the mindset of, these are the things you have to talk about. This is what needs to be done. Now, I do hope and I do wish that Trump's people are telling him hey, maybe don't go for a smiley handshake photo. This is a serious matter. This is something that you need to take lightly, because if things backfire extremely bad, Trump's, Nobel Peace Prize mindset, this could put him in that history book saying, this is a step that went really wrong and look how bad he was. And I'm sure Trump doesn't want that. And heck, I'll be honest with you, regardless if you're Republican or Democrat, you don't want the U.S. to look bad at all. Regardless if you don't like Trump, you have to also say to yourself, I want America to succeed, because if we don't, then that makes things worse for me. So when we come to this conversation of Trump meeting with him, let's hope that he truly does have Ukraine in mind and the United States in mind. Because if he doesn't, and he moves forward and he missteps and creates this Trump-Putin summit to be a major failure, that would make the U.S. look bad. And in history, they'll remember Trump as the guy who misstepped. That's where I'm going to leave you guys with today, in which we don't know what's going to happen. There are a lot of moving parts. The U.S. government is now downgrading said meeting. And truly speaking, it's a scary time. Once again, not trying to scare people. But when we find out whether or not Europe's got to be preparing for war or not, this is just something for the history books, something we need to document, because things could either be really, really good, Trump standing up against Putin, or really, really bad. We'll see what happens on Friday. I'll be sure to keep you guys updated. As a little reminder, they picked this summit for the worst time. I'm actually flying out to the West. And so I am actually going to be offline from that Saturday all the way through the following Wednesday. So you won't be seeing too much from me, whether on YouTube, TikTok, Substack. This is just my heads up to you. But if you want to sign up for my free news stack, Substack, there is a free link in the description. There's also a paid version of it in which you can have your name at the end of my long form videos. I greatly appreciate anyone who does sign up for that, as I'm an independent journalist who, I funny enough, having now a newsroom per se worldwide, with people reporting to us across the entire world. So if you want to support me, I'll put the link to that in my bio. Once again, I'll be sure to keep you updated. So please do subscribe, turn on notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. I'm Joey. I'll see you later.